This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Bigfoot and/or Sasquatch. Is it a myth? Is it a legend? Is it a hoax? And I have three people who will be talking about that. The subject is Bigfoot or Sasquatch, the man-ape of North America, the supposed man-ape. And I have three people who have written extensively on the subject. And I will give them each a chance to speak a little bit about themselves and their interests, and then we'll dig into the topic. On the left of the screen, it's Michelle Soulier, right?
Correct.
Okay, if you could give a little bit of background about who you are and what interests you about hairy man-apes.
Well, I am an author, illustrator, and a bookstore owner, and my interest in Bigfoot started when I was working on my Strange Maine blog and realized that there were actually accounts, historic accounts of Bigfoot-related creatures in Maine, and I scratched my head and was kind of fascinated by that, and so I started digging, and here I am over a decade later, deep in the hole. My latest book was Bigfoot in Maine, which came out earlier this year, and there will be a volume 2 at this point as well.
So when you talk about Strange Maine, do you also deal with ghosts, sightings of wee people, or whatever it might be?
Oh, yeah, anything anomalous, anything that falls through the cracks of the regular history books, that's the stuff I'm interested in, yeah.
Okay. Up on the upper right of the screen is Jeff Meldrum. Jeff, if you could also give a little bit of background about yourself and what you've written about the subject.
Well, I'm a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. So I teach human gross anatomy in the health professions programs and research the evolutionary history of human locomotion. And that's what brought sort of the tangent together, the notion of another bipedal hominoid still existing alongside our species is what piqued my interest. So I've been investigating the evidence for Sasquatch and doing field work myself, and laboratory studies and so forth on the footprints. Particularly, that's my area of specialty since 1995. And I have written a book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, that chronicles some of the evidence. It's 10, 15 years old now, so not quite 15, 10 years old. So some of the evidence or information there's needs a little updating. And in fact, the producer of the documentary that inspired that is well on his way to produce a Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2, where we'll update some of the various lines of evidence and new inroads that developing technologies have made possible.
So, of the three people, I believe you're the only academic. Taking on such a subject would seem to be risky to one's career. Have you gotten any flack about that?
Oh yes, lots. Yeah, no, it nearly derailed my career. I must admit, I'd rather say idealistic than naive, but I did not anticipate the firestorm that it would precipitate in some quarters. And so, yeah, it's been an uphill battle, and just to gain some legitimacy and credibility. But I've maintained high standards of academic research and discourse, and I think most of the naysayers have fallen to the wayside, either through attrition or through moving to other locations where there's less proximity. So no, it continues to be lumped with the tabloid, with the unjustifiably labeled as pseudoscience. And I mean, basically, the bottom line is simply: is there a biological species behind the legend, the mythos, as you referred to earlier? Is there a prospect that other species of hominoid or hominin even have persisted alongside us? There's been quite a paradigm shift just in the last half century, since the 60s. Our understanding of the pattern and process of human evolution a very bushy tree with many contemporaneous branches on this tree, and many branches that have in a confirmed manner persisted alongside us until the very recent past. So why should we assume that all of those branches have gone extinct, with the exception of Homo sapiens, when there's so much evidence that begs for attention?
Kelly Halls is the third of our guests, and she is a writer and has a website called, is it wondersofweird.com?
That's correct.
Could you give a little background about yourself and what you've written on the subject?
Yes, well, I studied journalism at Brigham Young University. I thought I was going to be an investigative reporter. And then I realized that I was much better suited to write for young readers rather than adults, although I have written for a lot of newspapers over the years. And I wanted to write a book about cryptozoology because I thought people were lying to kids. And I wanted to set it straight. And so when I started doing the research, a lot of the cryptid creatures, the mysteries, did seem to be a little less than authentic. But I was astonished to discover there was a lot of solid evidence for Bigfoot, for the hominid, or great ape, what school you're in. In fact, Dr. Meldrum's books were incredibly helpful to me. Jeff, that book is incredible. I still love it if it's old or not. But I discovered it was far more interesting than any of the other cryptids. And so I've kind of taken it in that direction. I talk to adults and kids, but kids are important to me. And I like to give them the skill set to develop their own critical thinking skills. And so I tend to go into some of these topics that make them go, yeah, but I think it might be real. And then we explore the evidence and encourage them not to fall for everything that you see, and yet not to believe that there are not new species yet to be discovered.
So let's talk about before we hit the science aspect of it, let's talk about the mythological folkloric aspects, because in an earlier show a few months ago, I barely touched on it on another subject, and I was talking about how there's real myths, what you call folklore, and then there's what you call fake lore. And a good example of fake lore is Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan was not a character that was, 150 years ago talked about in the logging camps. It was basically a character that was promoted by the logging industry in the early 1900s. And in talking with this other person, we were talking about Bigfoot and Yeti. And it seems to me that even though we hear all these stories about Native American myths of wild men and whatnot, they're not really that different from the Grendels of Beowulf fame or Enkidu from the Gilgamesh epic. And it seems to me that the founding of the Bigfoot myth in the 50s and 60s was a direct response to Sir Edmund Hillary and all the Yeti and abominable snowman stuff over in Asia, that we wanted our own sort of hairy biped. Let me start with you, Michelle. What is your response to that? Do you think that there is a direct lineage going back to Native Americana, or is Bigfoot more of a mass media product of the last 50 or so years?
Well, there's no doubt that there is tribal folklore attached to it. Most of that still exists only as oral history. And so I don't think, unless they were sharing a lot of campfires with the local tribes, that at least in Maine, folks would be picking up on that. I feel like there was a spate of wild man and ape man accounts in the turn of the century newspapers, like late 1800s into the early 1900s, that preceded that wave that really pushed Bigfoot over the top in the 50s and 60s. So I think the groundwork had been laid in our own press, in our own local legend making, and that was definitely part of the foundation. And I can't, I'm not terribly comfortable speaking on behalf of the tribal legends, because that's kind of a whole other thing. At least in Maine, it's it's still very much their own stories and their own accounts. But I think nationwide, there was a definite precedent in press, in newspapers, for wild men and ape men in the U.S.
Michelle, I'm sorry, Kelly.
I think that a lot of the Native American stories may be mythology, but I think some of it may be an accounting of sightings of the same animal that people say they've been sighting in more contemporary life. Also, you have to look at Asia, the Yaren. It's much older than the Native American stories. I think globally there have been stories of this bipedal hairy creature. So I'm not sure that it's just something that came up at the turn of the century in the United States of America. I think it's a lot deeper than that. Russia, all kinds of cultures have their own stories.
Jeff?
Well, definitely. I just returned from a speaking engagement in Natchez, Mississippi, where they had a, quote, Bigfoot bash celebrating the 300th birthday of what they hold as the first written mention of a man-like, hairy man-like giant creature, which appeared in the journals of a Jesuit priest who was one of the first to contact the Natchez Indians there. And so, you know, there, as was pointed out, there are stories of encounters with anomalous man-like monsters, if you will, from some of the earliest times that Westerners set foot on the continent. It's just that you always have to bear in mind the framework. At that time, they didn't even really have a concept of what a gorilla or a chimpanzee was, generally. And so it was described as a wild man, and often depicted as one might envision, you know, a vision of what the term wild man might elicit. A disheveled individual with long hair and a long beard, essentially. But then as more knowledge about the great apes became more widely known. I mean, one of the first appearances, I'm trying to remember the date, when one of the depictions of a chimpanzee appeared on an almanac in the colonies in the States, they then had another word they could use, and they started talking about these wild gorillas in the backwoods. And you're right, in the 50s, that was the heyday of the Everest expeditions, and the abominable snowman had captured people's attention. But you only have to go a decade back for the first really good journalistic account of giant 17-inch, 16 and 17-inch footprints in British Columbia that predated and actually anticipated the discovery of footprints in Northern California in remarkable similarity. And then, as Kelly pointed out, the real clincher for me was when I had the chance to go to China and actually talk with witnesses, contemporary witnesses there, examine footprint evidence that was indistinguishable from very telling footprints found in North America. Specifically, one great example from the Patterson-Gimlin film site itself, showing this remarkable pressure ridge that's become kind of the iconic cast to illustrate my model of the foot form and function, namely the mid-tarsal break, a distinctive characteristic. And so, you know, sometimes the skeptics like to dismiss it or gloss over it as just an expression of the human psyche. You know, it has roots back in Grendel and you know, other Western literary traditions, but there's a remarkable ecological underpinning to all of this too. We find these reports in habitats that are remarkably consistent for what we would envision the requirements to support a large omnivorous primate, a hominoid or hominin. I was struck one time. I was traveling and had picked up a magazine and was thumbing through it there in the airport, and there was an article about the imperiled status of the Asian tiger. And what jumped out at me was this map, and it had a map of Asia with the historic distribution of Asian tigers highlighted in one color, and then in the contrasting color were the fragmented refugia where those tigers now hang on barely existing. And what struck me was those highlighted fragmented areas were exactly places where I have example of Sasquatch-like hominoid footprints. You know, so it's not that they're somehow linked to tigers, but they share a common niche, a habitat, wet, dense forest cover environments. So how would you explain that kind of a tight correlation other than to acknowledge that this is a biological species, not just a myth? I mean, we would expect there to be myths and folklore.
Yeah.
There was a saying one time, there is no history without legend and no legend without history. They're inextricably woven together. We make sense of our experiences, especially in the pre-enlightenment, scientific period. We make sense of our experiences by making stories about them, telling stories.
Well,
And those stories.
doesn't the word orangutan in Malaya, or maybe it's in some Indonesian tongue, mean man of the forest?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So
but
that seems to be a common link.
But unlike a gorilla or an orangutan or any of the bonobos or chimps, the Sasquatch or Bigfoot doesn't have like 4 hands. It has a human-like supposed foot with arches, and so is there when I've heard that some casts have dermal ridges on the bottom of the feet, and some have supposedly had, like, you could tell that perhaps the creature had a broken foot at one time.
Right.
If Jeff, if you want to just take that one, since you've.
Oh, sure. There are all sorts of anatomical features that suggest that these are anything but simply a enlarged facsimile of a human foot. Using the human foot as inspiration. You're right that the known great apes have a divergent big toe of varying degrees. The orangutan has actually almost lost its big toe. Typically, it lacks that distal phalanx and nail, and the big toe is just basically a nub that can press against or wedge against these remarkably long hook-like toes. So they've taken it to the extreme. I mean, there's no question that we're members of the superfamily Hominoidea, and we do differ from them by that lack or loss of a divergent big toe. We look at the earliest hominins, like Australopithecines, and they have also relinquished that divergence, but still rather splayed. They have obviously similar degrees of splay could be seen in human species or human populations that have never worn shoes. But Ardipithecus has been proposed, I think, on rather shaky grounds as a hominin ancestor, and it has a toe that sticks out as dramatically as a chimpanzee. So we still don't understand the actual timing and transition of that characteristic. And I always tell people, my humanity doesn't reside in the position of my big toe. There are a lot more important telling characters. The configuration of the toes has more to do with adaptations for various types of locomotion. For a large bipedal terrestrial primate to have likewise either convergently or as a shared characteristic from an early shared ancestor, maybe Sasquatch, I've argued that Sasquatch could also be looked at as an early hominin, like something like a robust Australopithecine. The resemblances in proportion of the cranial features, the depth of the jaws, the flat face, and so forth, the lack of projecting canines are all characteristics shared with robust Australopithecines, and admittedly also perhaps to the extent we have fossil evidence, Gigantopithecus, they seem remarkably convergent in that chewing adaptation, and that just highlights one feature. Highlights one point that's important to make is evolution is extremely, if you want to say, resourceful. Nature is resourceful. Evolution is the mechanism by which that resourcefulness is refined and selected and shaped. But it's not at all uncommon for nature to solve similar challenges with similar morphologies, even from slightly different starting points. So those characters have arisen independently, but in this case, from a very similar starting point, as opposed to examples like dolphins and sharks have a similar body form, but they've evolved from very different courses.
Kelly, you look like you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Well, there was something that I came up. I wrote a book for kids called Wild Horses, and I studied the migration of the horse, which originated in North America and then found its way to other corners of the world. And when I realized how capable that migration was, thanks to the Bering Strait and a lot of other places, and then I started studying Bigfoot, looking for evidence on whether or not that could be a possibility and by all of its names, I was encouraged at the possibility of it being a real creature, animal, because it was sprinkled all over the world, because it might have made a similar migration from wherever it originated to other places in the world. To me, that's the support for the possibility of an animal being real. If you've only seen it in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the odds are slimmer that this is going to pan out to be a real animal. But if it pops up all over the world and follows a similar pattern to other migrations with dogs and horses and creatures that went from here to there, humanity is another example. We started in Africa and migrated our way around. That to me was encouraging on the possibility that this might actually be an animal. And if it is, it deserves study. Dr. Meldrum has done the most effective parts. He got a professional paper reviewed. Smart. Went to a guy named Martin Lockley, a paleontologist. Paleontologists have taken footprint evidence as absolutely legitimate evidence for hundreds of years. I thought it was just brilliant when I saw that Dr. Meldrum had gone to Martin Lockley so that he could get a peer-reviewed paper. It was just so brilliant.
Michelle, you want to comment? Do you want to comment?
I don't have the academic and physiological background that Dr. Meldrum has. But one of the things I do talk to people about, because a lot of people have questions about it, is, is this the same kind of creature from region to region? And, the one thing I remind people about is like the borders that we look at today, they're imaginary lines on a map. Like animals of any sort, creatures of any sort, they're not paying attention to those lines. They're going wherever the terrain and the resources that are available to them direct them. And so, of course, there's going to be traces through various regions as they shift through and find the places that work best for them. They're not stopping at the New Hampshire border between Maine and New Hampshire, or the border between Maine and Canada. So the movement and the similarities that crisscross North America are once you start looking, it's very present. And it's a good thing to remind people that those borders they're not real in the physical world. So
before we start, let's just continue with the scientific aspect here for a little bit before we start to the mythic stuff. A lot of times you'll hear the coelacanth being used as a species that was thought to be extinct for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, I think in its case, and then found off the coast of South Africa. But the argument against that would be that the coelacanth was living at great depths. No one was it wasn't active like tuna hunting grounds. Whereas here, and if we expand it just beyond North America, whether it's Yetis or Sasquatches, they are reported in places that are not too far from a human habitation. In some areas like Florida, it's hard to imagine how a Florida skunk ape or a breeding population could get in there. So let me start with the two ladies here. To me, that's one of the biggest things, is that when people talk, they talk about the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot as if it's just one thing, as if Bigfoot is just, zipping through interdimensional portals. Oh, he's in Maine, he's in Portland, Oregon tomorrow. There has to be, but before you could get genetic inbreeding that wipes out a species, there would have to be populations of, I think for humans it's something like 100 to 150 pairs. So how would hundreds of these creatures be able to mate, breed, give birth? And yet, as far as I know, there's no definitive scatological evidence. There's no definitive bone evidence. And there's just no evidence of even tools being made. I mean, there are no Clovis points that they're making. So let me start with Michelle, and we'll work our way back to Jeff. What is your argument against that argument?
My argument, I would say Maine has a tremendous amount of very sparsely populated area. So there's plenty of elbow room for anything that wants to exist in the state alongside humans. Maine is, unlike our neighbors to the south, like Massachusetts and stuff like that, there are a lot of communities in Maine where you have a little urban center, and then 10 minutes drive from that, you're deep in the country. And there's a much fewer people. The populations tend to cluster around the highways and around the coast. But the bulk of the state remains pretty wide open. So there's plenty of room for them to exist fairly unobserved. And I mean, we have our black bear population. I think the stuff I was looking at, they were regulating it at around 36,000 black bears in the state. And, you know, those of us in the south of the state, we rarely see bears, except for sometimes in the communities that are encroaching on a lot of the woodland, where you might have problem animals that become used to utilizing human food resources. But up in the north, I've talked to a lot of people who spend a lot of time up there, and you don't see the bears very often. Even up there, they tend to be shy and stay away from you. The one time I saw a black bear was up on one of the logging roads, and it immediately just ran away from us. Like it was gone. So there are ways, I think, that a savvy animal would be able to stay out of sight, and have a breeding population that, although there are eyewitnesses I've spoken to who have run into family groups. So they're in more than one occurrence. So it does seem like there are clusters which are breeding, and, based on what the eyewitnesses are seeing, are having kind of multi-generational groups together. And, we can speculate, we can say that, maybe some of the youngsters, once they get old enough, split off, like with many other animal groups, and they go find their own territory and spread out so that they're not so concentrated. But that's, I don't think biologically and spatially there's any reason why they couldn't have a breeding population that could stay out of sight and go about their business without humans interfering with it most of the time.
Kelly, what's your take on evidence or the lack thereof?
I've spent most of my life backpacking and camping and in the wilderness. It's just something that I've always loved to do. And I'm 63 years old, and in 63 years, I've seen one wolf. And wolves are relatively intelligent. They're relatively inclined not to want to associate with human beings unless they've been socialized to take food, like the bears. So I think the fact that we don't see them doesn't negate the fact that they might exist. Also, we're not factoring into the consideration that they may be highly intelligent. And if I'm a smart creature, I'm going to stay away from human beings because we have guns and we're not very kind to each other. So if it's me, I'm teaching my kids to stay away from those. Those animals are dangerous. So it's not scientific. It's not anything Dr. Meldrum can back me up on, but I think it's possible that they take an active choice to avoid being detected by humanity. There may be young. I mean, if I've got a kid who was constantly looking for trouble when she was little, so maybe little Sasquatches want to see what's happening at the campsite, but there's every chance that they don't want to be found. And if they don't want to be found, that even betters our chances.
Well, but one of the things that I think would argue against that, because when I was talking about, it was the show I did on the Aleutian people and coming off over the Bering Land Bridge. And that is that it seems that one of the major theories, and Jeff, I don't know if you have studied this, is that when the Asians came over and became the Native Americans, they encountered 2 continents worth of animals that had no fear of humans. So they were able to, this was happy hunting grounds because these animals hadn't grown up alongside, these humans as they did in Africa and Asia. And it would seem to me that I could understand maybe Bigfoot or Sasquatch being afraid of humans if they had actively been hunted, but then we'd have evidence of them. So it doesn't. There seems to be a cognitive dissonance in saying that. Well, they would be afraid of human beings, but they would only be afraid if we were slaughtering them like we did the bison. No.
Isn't it possible they observe the slaughter of other animals?
Yeah, but human beings will too, and we slaughter each other, don't we? I mean, I'm just saying. Jeff, what is your take on that?
Some of us avoid crowds.
No, you raised some interesting questions, and I've heard that theory about the lack of fear in animals. Although I think it's a pretty instinctual. I mean, any prey item, when faced with a predator, it's not like I mean, well, there just isn't any place in the world where you go out and animals just walk up to you and nuzzle and climb into your lap. You know, I don't think it even requires. While these creatures may be more intelligent than your average bear, as Yogi would say, on the scale between great apes and us, there's a lot of space. I don't think it requires. I mean, all you do is talk to hunters who go after that trophy buck that they were looking for or had spotted before the season started, and then suddenly it's vanished. I don't think it takes extraordinary smarts beyond instinctual behaviors to avoid human contact. And people just don't appreciate the way in which nature takes care of tidying up after itself. I looked up, Michelle, while you were talking, in fact, so quickly on my phone, and yes, 36,000 was the top estimate of black bear, which really stunned me because Idaho has an estimated population of 35,000, and we have the most wilderness of any of the lower 48 in our state, the wilderness and roadless areas. So that's really an impressive population. I've come to offer the black bear range and density of population as sort of a rule of thumb when considering the potential for Sasquatch, because there's actually a published paper that did demonstrate a remarkable correlation between the bioclimatic factors determining range distribution of black bear and the range of reported Bigfoot sightings and footprint evidence. And so that makes perfect sense. It doesn't require a lot of credentials behind your name to recognize that those animals have similar needs. And then when you take into account, I mean, I would estimate that for every 100 to 200 black bear, there's one Sasquatch. And I won't go into how I arrive at that. It's just based on a lot of clues of observations of behavior and solidarity and so forth. But in Idaho, the best reference book on black bears is called "The Shadows in the Forest," alluding to their remarkable elusiveness. And it's not surprising then that another animal could also be just as elusive. Dr. Krantz used to make a habit of asking his audiences how many had ever found the skeleton or bone of a black bear that hadn't been hit by a car or shot by a hunter. And in decades of asking that question, he never had an affirmative response. I haven't asked it consistently, but I've only encountered 2 people who volunteered, yes, that they found a bear skull in their hiking time in the woods. So, you think about black bears only live to be about 25. A Sasquatch, a large-bodied ape or hominin, would probably live to be 45 to 60, especially given their large size. There's a positive correlation with body size and longevity. So even the turnover rate is much lower, would be much lower, let's speak hypothetically, would be much lower for a large-bodied creature like an ape, like Sasquatch versus black bear. And so that the fact that we haven't found a bone that has been identified as Sasquatch, you mentioned scat. We have scat, but how do you differentiate 2 large omnivores? The scat differs in consistency, even in shape and content, depending on what they ate 2 or 3 days previous. And seasonally. And so the only way to really know for sure is the DNA analysis. And so far we haven't successfully. You have to have a warm, steaming scat that's less than 8 hours old in order for there to be any DNA of the defecator rather than the defecation to be present. So I hate to always be put in a position where I have to offer an apologist's explanation, but it's not at all unreasonable. I mean, if that's your hang up, then not you, but if that is someone's hang up, then they're willfully ignoring all of the affirmative evidence that suggests that there is something there. I one time, just to illustrate this, I spoke at the University of Wyoming, gave a talk at an anthropology class, and then that evening a much broader audience, a campus-wide talk and community invitee. And the department chairman of the anthro department asked a question afterward about physical remains. He was a forensic anthropologist, so he was used to cataloging the physical traces of human populations and their activities. And so the absence of that was troubling to him. Why? And I had offered, an answer that had many of the components that we've discussed here as a group. And so over dinner, I asked him. I said, "Did you find that answer satisfying?" And kind of qualified it as an apologist's answer and so forth. He said, "Actually, no, I didn't." And then he explained from his discipline, from his perspective, what he really needed to see as positive evidence. And I said, well, it's interesting that so many people, yourself, but other skeptics, sometimes skeptics with the capital S, the ideological skeptics, they have their favorite missing piece of the puzzle, their missing evidence, and they fixate on that to the ignoring of everything else. And I expressed that to him, and he said, "Oh, well, what evidence are you referring to?" And I rather bluntly said, "Well, you were at my talk. You did sit through my presentation." And I said, "Well, no." I said, from my expertise, from my point of view, the footprint evidence makes by far the most compelling case. No matter what you think is missing, you have to account for that." And he goes, here is his response: "Oh, I'm not an expert on footprints." And my response was, "Well, I am. Don't you think I deserve the same deference that I would give you if you were presenting a case based on your forensic, anthropological, or archaeological evidence?" So that changed the tone of the conversation a little bit afterwards. But this is so true. It's so often true. Whether the person involved in the conversation recognizes it or not, they're unwilling to even entertain the possibility, and more often than not, they don't have the wherewithal to evaluate it, even if they were willing to entertain it.
So I wanted to pick up, Jeff, on what you had said. It's interesting because I didn't think I'd even discuss this, but in 1976, the bicentennial year, I was 11 years old. I was up at a friend of mine's summer home. I spent a week up there, and it was not too far from Kingston, New York, in the Catskills. And I and my friend and his cousin came across a dead black bear. I don't know if it was shot, but it certainly had been predated in some way by something. And that brings me to the idea, though, putting aside even humans hunting other humans like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, to extinction possibly, it would seem to me that either Bigfoot or Sasquatches, even if they were omnivores, they would have to be hunters. If they are able to elude, they would have to be using tools. They would have to be hunting other creatures, or they would certainly, some of them would have fallen victim to wolf packs, because even the most trained mountain men of a couple of 100 years ago would sometimes fall prey to a grizzly or a pack of wolves. Let me start with you, Jeff, and then I'll ask the ladies. What is the current thinking about what a Sasquatch is? Would it be omnivorous, carnivorous? Would it be like a gorilla, just a gentle giant, or what?
Well, the thinking based on the anecdotal evidence is that it's omnivorous, that it eats everything from roots and berries up to deer and elk. And so I would take exception to your comment that hunting does not necessarily require tools. I mean, obviously there are lots of carnivores who hunt, and either through strength of limb or tooth and claw, this creature could certainly dispatch any animal that's out there with its own strength. I mean, if this animal has, or creature has, being, however you want to qualify it, to tread on that fine line between ape and more hominin or human-like, but it still has the body build, the muscle mass, by all accounts, and examples, displays of strength of that of a large-bodied ape. It's been said that a chimp or a gorilla has 5+ times human strength because of just the nature, the physiology of their muscles and the muscle mass. I mean, we as a species are lean, mean running machines. We've evolved for endurance running and walking, and have evolved a much lighter frame, both skeletal and muscular, as well as other physiological adaptations that allow for the ability to exert ourselves in a remarkable way. Our sweat glands throughout, covering our body, much greater densities and numbers than other apes have, for example. But anyway, the point being, their diet, covers the gambit, I think. And I'll again qualify one comment you make. There's not a single recorded incident known of wolves attacking humans, killing humans. So that's kind of the
maybe not in North America, but in Europe certainly there was the famous.
That could be. I'm not familiar with the tradition there.
Yeah. But Michelle, so what are we talking about with this? The general Bigfoot or Sasquatch profile. I mean, it's what, 7 to 10 feet. Is this a creature that, as Jeff might suggest, could maybe take on a grizzly bear and hold its own?
It's I would, based on eyewitnesses' observations, and a lot of these eyewitnesses were hunters who are, very aware of the physical presence of the creatures around them and how they could become a hazard as opposed to a target for them. And I would say yes, it's a real mix. I think in most cases, they're going to be, if they're hunting because they need to hunt. They need the protein. There might not be enough food sources around at that time of the year, or they have more in their group to feed than, just berries and nuts are going to do the trick for. I've talked to people who think that they have interrupted group hunting, where members are kind of trying to route deer into a particular place so that they can ambush them. I've talked to other people who have found deer literally pulled limb from limb, here in Maine. And, I'm not saying a black bear couldn't have done that, but I'm saying that, these, traces of this sort of behavior are being found, that it's not human predation, it's something else. And I mean, it's not just the big animals, it's also the small ones. I talked to a woman who saw them eat fish, out of the ponds, fish and clams. Another person who found traces where it looked like they might have killed a grouse, which is like a pheasant type, a mostly ground dwelling bird. And apparently quite delicious, but there was also, at the site, there was also a stick that looked like it had been used as part of the dismantling process. So, there's probably at least some moderate tool use. And certainly if they're trying to channel deer for an ambush, it was also observed in those same areas that certain trees were bent to kind of make obstacles to push them in a certain direction and route them. So that's essentially tool using too. So they're not any, this is, I mean, there's a lot of layers to this, but you could say that, there are probably the kind of standard population, at least in Maine, seems to be fairly utilitarian in their omnivorousness. They make use of what's available. They don't go out of their way to kill extraneous animals. I know there's some accounts elsewhere of domestic animals who apparently caused an annoyance or a threat being killed, but I have not talked to anybody who's dealt with that before. I know a lot of people's dogs are very scared when they've, kind of brushed up against encounters. So the dogs are aware that this is something they should avoid. But yeah, the strength is there, the ability is there, and I think the strength mostly exists as a threat to keep other creatures in line and out of their territory. There's most of the aggressive behavior is very territorial, it seems like, and they basically inform the other creature, but be it human or not, that, you don't want to mess with me. You want to go the other way, away from me because of this, So it's the physiognomy is available, but they don't seem, most of them, the majority of them don't seem to be using it in a way that's reckless or, promiscuous destruction of other animals.
Kelly, do these creatures, do you think, use fire? Are they in the Stone Age, or where along the Homo sapiens path would they be, do you think?
I haven't seen any evidence of fire in the Bigfoot culture, the Sasquatch culture, although it may exist. I may just not know about it. I did want to add something to it. When you're talking about predatory apex predators, I'm not sure a bear would challenge a Bigfoot. I think animals have a tendency to avoid the possibility of a deadly injury. But I'm not sure, other than growling and saying the vocalizations to back off, because I'm big and you're big and let's leave it alone. And you're also, when you talk about predatory animals, throughout the history of life on Earth, there have been lots of predators that feed on the young, which would be much easier to stalk and capture. Dinosaurs fed on young. It's been documented in many species. So that's another possibility. Maybe they don't go after the biggest buck in the woods. Maybe they go after animals. And I realize that's sort of seasonal, but there are a lot of animals that, owls, they have their young in the winter. So at least some owls do. I had a barn owl that was hunting my chickens once for a wintry flock of babies. So I think there are lots and lots of in an omnivorous creature, which that's why wolves and dogs have survived so successfully, is because they were not opportunistic eaters. They would eat anything that they could find. And so if their game was short, then they ate grass and mice. And if, game was rich, then the grasses got bigger. And I would have to assume that Sasquatch was the same way. And again, there was something else we touched on. I wrote a book called Death Eaters on scavengers. And to me, it's no mystery at all that we haven't found a body, because scavengers on this planet are remarkable cleanup. I mean, it's from the insects to the skunks to the raccoons to the wolves to the bears. Anything that will eat carrion will take its piece and carry it off. So you're not going to find a whole body. And who's to say Sasquatch doesn't bury their dead? Primitive people did.
So let's talk about more of the mythological stuff, and let's actually work our way back from this modern internet age. Even in the internet age, there's a joke around the internet, and this is not just with Bigfoot, but with any ghosts or Loch Ness monsters or chupacabras. Is like, families out on a picnic, they see something weird, and the husband said, "Honey, go get the worst camera we have and let Junior, who's never taken a photo before, take the photo," because inevitably, you only see grainy footage on photographs, whether it's aliens coming to abduct or anything. And even those that seemingly are better, a lot of the photos and a lot of the videos are either such obviously easily faked with modern technology, or they're just so obviously not the thing that they think they are. So from a cultural perspective, do you think a lot of these people that have these websites or YouTube channels that, Bigfoot.com, or, that oh, here's the latest photo of that the trees are swaying in the wind. I see eyes there. I see eyes there. But do these people hurt the case for cryptids in general and Bigfoot specifically, or not? Let me start with you, Kelly.
I think there are two groups of people. I think there are fame seekers that just want to get on TV or to be famous. I mean, you get money for hits on YouTube. You have advertising and you get a check. So I think a lot of people, and those people do damage the potential of real discovery. But I think there are other people that have had sincere experiences. I talked to a truck driver once, and he went out with a Bigfoot group just to play with the night vision goggles. He told me from the front, I don't believe in Bigfoot. I'm just going to go and have fun. And when he did see a creature, he wet his pants. And see, that kind of story to me, some big burly truck driving guy who would say to me, when I saw this thing, it was huge. It terrified me. Here we were standing face to face. They just stumbled on each other, and they both sort of puffed up. And he wet his pants because he thought, I'm going to die. And then they took off in different directions. Again, apex predators tend to avoid, except for human beings. So I think there are some people that do damage the possibility, but it's pretty easy to spot the ones that are fake. And honestly, on YouTube, the majority of them have no reason to be considered. I think I can think of 3, apart from the Patterson-Gimlin film, that I thought, well, this is promising.
There was a fellow a few years ago. I remember I was working an overnight job, and I'd sometimes watch YouTube videos on a break. And he's now no longer on YouTube, but there's a fairly famous video in Bigfoot circles of a supposed couple taking a video of their car's rear camera and backing up because they supposedly ran over a Bigfoot. And a guy's breaking down this scene, and anyone who's ever driven a truck knows that if you look at those cameras, there's the little lines that go in the center when you're backing up and something's going beep 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 beep, and so it's not a 2-lane road. And this guy who's supposedly an expert comes up and he's saying, "Oh, here's the creature rising up. Look, and look at there's a road, and the center of the road. He's got to be at least 10 to 12 feet tall." I said, and I'm like, "No, you moron. That's those broken lines are not on the road. That's the camera." And so it was clearly something half the size. And there are literally there are still lots of, and I even tried to get a couple of email a couple of people with these kinds of channels if they were interested, but no. But let me ask you, Michelle, and then I'll go to Jeff. Do you think that people like some of these people that it's clearly fake or it's clearly not what they're saying, but they're so enthusiastic that, well, geez, we just heard some noise in the woods somewhere. And another one was a cable show, I remember, where they hung something up, a picnic basket like Yogi Bear, 12 feet up there, and they said, it's gone. Who could it be? And they looked at the video camera, and it was raccoons that went along the wire and got it. It's like, so do a lot of the people who are the most enthusiastic Bigfooters, if we call them, do they do the most damage to the claims?
I feel like most of those people are so prolific that everybody kind of develops a blind spot for them if they're not on board with them. And so they just sort of go with, it's water under the bridge. I think the ones that are much more challenging are the ones who have like a one-time thing that happens, especially if it's somebody who's seeking fame and they really try to push it. I think those are the ones, they're the ones that get press. They're the ones that, really point up some of the foolishness that's inherent in that, segment of the community. The people who are trying to monetize, the people who are trying to, become infamous so that they can go to conferences and collect fees for just being there. I think those are the people that, the ones who cook up a hoax, I think are probably the most damaging. I think, most folks, the people who are super blob squatch aficionados, like the ones that's their thing, they love going into the old photos and finding blobs that, they can kind of matrix and imagine it's Bigfoot. I think most of us understand that that's a human tendency to want to see something. And so I feel like that isn't so much of a discredit to the serious Bigfoot investigator community, because, everybody knows that there are people who really, really want to see Bigfoot. And, there's a certain amount of compassion, I think, that goes with dealing with those people, because, they just really, really want something. And, they keep trying to create it for themselves. So those, I don't think those people are the ones that are causing the field problems. I think it's the people who are monetizing and fame seeking.
Blob squatch. That's sort of the people who just see anything and they think it's a blob. It's like the face on Mars, which was only a face if you didn't take into account that there was a few digitized pixels that were missing. But Jeff, what is your take on people, either outright fakers or the people who want to believe so much that they'll see a snap twig and they'll say, this was a war between Sasquatch clans,
Well, it's a challenge, obviously, and especially approaching it from my perspective, my point of departure, because it makes it challenging to identify the legitimate and credible pieces of evidence. I mean, I honestly don't spend much time on social media because it's just not worthwhile. You spend more time winnowing chaff than you do. And I find that there are enough, there are plenty of people who are very sincere and very intelligent people who identify, who don't have the opportunity to be involved academically like I do. So one of the roles they fill is to be a filter and bring to my attention, they're sort of my first set of the first line of defense of peer reviewers. And so they draw my attention to those things that are worthy of more consideration. One of the efforts that we've tried to emphasize is the notion of citizen science. That was the motivation behind the publication of my field guide initially, was kind of a how-to admonish people and to encourage people to critically and objectively and rationally identify and discriminate and document and report reliable evidence, so they could take a helpful role in the search. And quite honestly, people have different motivations. They have different ambitions. But one of the challenges I find is, as a scientist, you're trained up from very early on in your education and your graduate education and training to subject your observations and conclusions to peer review. And you have to be able to somewhat detach yourself and from that and be open-minded to critical review of your hypothesis, your evidence, your interpretation and conclusions. But the non-scientist has never had that gone through that process, has never been steeled by the process of having to accept criticism and course correct and reevaluate and so forth. And so for them, that piece of evidence, however tenuous it might be, that's kind of their golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. And when you challenge the legitimacy of that evidence, they take it as a personal affront because it threatens their claim to participation, their membership in the fraternity of Bigfoot enthusiasts. And so, there are many who just don't want any expert evaluation of their evidence. I mean, as long as it's sealed up in that envelope, then it could be a Sasquatch hair. But as soon as you put it under the microscope and inform them, I'm sorry, but it's a deer hair, then poof, their balloon pops, and it's a very deflating experience for them. So it's a challenge. I mean, and this has scared away a lot of academics. But I mean, it's in large measure, it's a consequence of academics stepping back and not taking this subject seriously, being too ultra conservative, not being willing to buck a prevailing paradigm or to think outside the box and let the evidence speak for itself. You know, the quality, the credible evidence. And so in that vacuum, you get all sorts of enthusiasts. And I find that the intentional hoaxers are pretty rare.
Yeah.
You know, there have been a few, and there's some classic cases, and there have been a few persistent hoaxers, but far and away, I deal with individuals who are overly enthusiastic, who overinterpret, who imbue what they're seeing with too much significance. So, you know, potholes that bear the slightest resemblance to a footprint, or, you know, every strand of hair they pick up, not realizing the hair persists in the environment remarkably long. And so even if there was a legitimate encounter, just because you pull a strand of hair off of a bush doesn't mean it came from what you saw. It could have been there for a long, long time. And, you know, pareidolia is, if I pronounced that right, I always think I say it wrong, but the tendency to see patterns in random data, you know, seeing the Virgin Mary in the grain of wood of a sod, you know, or Elvis on a piece of toast. You know, our brains look for patterns, and once you have the image of a footprint or the image of a bipedal figure walking on the ridgeline, then it's kind of hard to shake that when you're really motivated.
So working our way backwards, I want to go to, I guess, what could probably be called the golden age of Bigfoot, which would have been sort of the 60s and 70s. I call it the golden age because you had the Patterson-Gimlin footage, which was supposedly, I guess, the first claimed video or film of it. And by the end of the 70s, Bigfoot had become not just a possible physical creature, but a metaphysical creature. And you may remember, you're probably all old enough to remember a show called The $6 Million Man with Lee Majors. And one of the recurring creatures on there was, I think in 6 or 7 episodes, Bigfoot played, I think first by Andre the Giant, a professional wrestler, and then I think it was played by the fellow Ted Cassidy, who played Lurch on the Addams Family. I believe it was Lurch. In there, you got the mixture of that Bigfoot somehow was either robotic or a creature that worked for aliens trying to, you know, invade Earth. And that sort of worked its way into the 1980s. I think saw a melding of this with things like alien abductions and Whitley Strieber's Communion. And so you had a lot of these metaphysical strands being tied together. And Bigfoot went from being just a physical creature to something possibly interdimensional, and you know, that it's a projection of the human psyche. So let me start with you, Kelly. What is your take on that era when we had sort of this meta Bigfoot?
Well, I think in that era there was no serious scientific exploration of the concept of Bigfoot, and I think a lot of people, to me, I've interviewed Bob Gimlin 2 or 3 times, and he's one of the most credible witnesses I've ever talked to, because I interviewed one guy who I thought it was going to be in my book. When I write for kids, I look for the best possible evidence. That's why I have Dr. Meldrum in my books. That's why I interviewed Bob Gimlin. I go to these Bigfoot conferences and I evaluate the people that speak, and then the people that feel the most dedicated to a more scientific approach. Those are the people that I go ahead and interview for my projects, because when you write for a kid, you better try to get it right, because you are responsible for planting seeds in these little brains. And so that's why, poor Dr. Meldrum, I bothered you for Tales of the Cryptid Den and Search of Sasquatch. You were always very generous. There's a reason for that. I wanted somebody credible. So, yeah, there were a lot of people that weren't credible during that golden era. I didn't get a chance to meet Roger Patterson. I've heard stories on both sides of the argument for that story. But I found Bob Gimlin incredibly sincere, incredibly thoughtful. I didn't feel like he was expanding his experiential story to puff it up, to make it more elaborate. I found him to be just this really straightforward guy who talked about something that happened to him. Are there others that were nuts? Yeah, there still are. I wrote a book on ghosts because kids were coming to me telling me how scared they were of ghosts, all these TV shows. And I didn't want to write a book on ghosts because you can't prove they're real and you can't prove they're not real. There's no way to really scientifically do it. But when I went to one paranormal haunted house in San Diego, California, I mentioned that I had interest in Sasquatch and Bigfoot, and the paranormal investigator told me, no, I know why no one's ever caught one. And I said, why? And she said, because they have time travel portals. And that was 8 years ago. So you're talking about the golden age, but it still exists. There are people who will tell you you will never catch a Bigfoot because they just open the portal and go through to their real time.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. It's great fiction.
Well, I call it the golden age because you had Eric Von Däniken, you had In Search of with Leonard Nimoy. The 1970s was fervid with all that stuff. Michelle, what is your take on that kind of melding of stuff? And I know, just to speak of the Patterson-Gimlin footage, people who believe in it say they see breasts on the creature, and others who don't believe it say they see a zipper. But I don't see breasts and I don't see a zipper whenever I watch it, even when they've blown it up. So what is your take on that Patterson-Gimlin footage?
The Patterson-Gimlin footage is undeniably compelling. I wrestle with myself about it because, we're looking at enhanced versions of it, and digitization can create its own artifacts. And so I love that it exists. I'm fascinated by it like everybody else. But, like many other people, I'm kind of waiting to see what happens. But it's undeniably iconic, and it's riveting. I've watched that footage over and over and over and over again. And sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm totally convinced. And other times I'm like, that shape seems a little, but it's, I would love it to be absolutely exactly what Patterson and Gimlin said it was. Because, it's that kind of weird happenstance where you cross paths with the thing that, so many of my eyewitnesses have had similar experiences, but they didn't have a camera with them, or they were so shocked they couldn't even think to pull their camera out. So, there's no denying its importance to the Bigfoot field. And so far as the kind of high strangeness end of things, where Bigfoot wound up getting hybridized into the UFO scene, and that's still, like Kelly said, that's still going on. People are still, like, one of the questions I keep getting when I do library talks is, how does that tie together? Like, what is happening to link Bigfoot with UFOs? And, the best I can do is tell them, they're undeniably elusive. They appear to be able to be completely silent or completely still, which we as humans have a hard time getting our head around because we're a very loud, active species, and we don't worry too much about what happens because of it in general these days. And so it baffles people that a creature could do that just naturally. And the other thing is there are stories where people have seen, big tracks in the snow, which end and don't go anywhere. And, so there are all these little apocryphal stories, and, people who say the Bigfoot just vanished. It was just gone.
Well, that reminds me of in England there was a supposed called Spring-Heeled Jack. That would somehow jump around, and he would jump over 40-foot walls, and the footprints would be here and then gone. Let me turn to Jeff though about the Patterson-Gimlin and just ask you. 2 points I want to make and then get your opinion. I do a series of shows called Why This Film Is Great, and one of the films I did was called Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni, and it's about a guy, a photographer, who takes a photo and thinks he's photographed a murder, and he's blowing it up, and then he sees a body, what seems to be a body in the park where he took the photo, but as he blows it up, it gets more clear. But that's not what reality is. The more you blow a photo up, you lose information. And secondly, to the real world equivalent of the Patterson-Gimlin footage would be the JFK assassination. And, you know, there's always the controversy, did it come from this direction, or was it simply the bullet going through the head from what's his face, Oswald, and sending the head backward. And then recently, during the Syrian war, there was this interesting phenomenon called Syrian headshot videos, where you'd see Syrian soldiers shooting and killing someone, and then they'd stand up and they'd get shot in the head. And the head would always go in the direction the bullet came, which is something you couldn't do ethically to prove which direction the bullet came to kill JFK. So my question is, with something like the Patterson-Gimlin, do you ever think there's going to be a thing where there's going to be, in 50 years, enhancement technology or some kind of way to determine whether that was a hoax or not? Because as I said, I don't see breasts and I don't see zippers.
Well, I can show you breasts,
Yeah.
and I can't show you zipper because there is none.
No.
There are none. You know, when you enlarge something, you don't lose information. You just don't gain information. I mean, what is there, whether it's pixels or whether it's the grain, the resolution provided by the grain. Now, in this case, this is pre-digital era, so it was grain, not pixels. And that's the problem, is when you have a 16 millimeter film with emulsion. This was extremely fine grained film stock. It was the best you could have possibly used at the time. And you're enlarging a 1.8 millimeter tall figure, you know, to an 8 by 10 sheet of paper or a print. You're going to get grain. You're going to, like I said, nothing is lost, but you don't gain any more information. It's not like a spy satellite where you have remarkable resolution that can enlarge to the point that you can see a cigarette package on the dock of the wharf. I mean, we have about reached the limit of what can be gleaned. I'll put in a plug here. In an upcoming episode of The Proof Is Out There on the History Channel, will be a 1-hour documentary special on the Patterson-Gimlin film, featuring the work that I've been doing together with Bill Munns and a new actor on the scene. Isaac Tian is a young graduate student, University of Washington, who does computer, not enhancement, and we avoid using that term because there's no information that's added. There's nothing nothing resolving or interpolating information that isn't already there. But what we do have is, in the absence of the original, we have this pedigree of copies. And Bill and I have now assembled, you know, as many as a dozen copies, and Bill has scanned these images at very high resolution, type 4K, you know, so there we have a digital image of that film frame with its grain. And now we can take those and actually superimpose them. By superimposing them, we average out the artifacts that are the result of individual copies from one film to another film, not digital copies, but actual transfers. You know, in before digital imagery, they would take that film and lay it on an unexposed roll of film and create a copy. But those great crystals don't line up, you know, point for point like pixels do. Pixels are discrete information that you can copy, you know, quantitatively in such a way that no information is lost or negligible through, you know, just corruption of copy error. But in any case, by doing that, by overlapping, and what Isaac did is he created an algorithm that does this automatically for numerous copies of numerous individual frames. and aligns them by well-established landmarks in not only 2 dimensions, but 3 dimensions, because the camera was moving and gyrating, tilting as he was running and walking.
And
And so
falling.
it superimposes all those. It nullifies many of the grained artifacts, and then what you see is remarkably clear and dense colors, and I mean, it's not necessarily an aha moment, but what it does is, I mean, you can see things like the breasts even more clearly. You can see the various anatomical features that I've drawn attention to with much greater confidence now. And you can ignore the spurious observations of things like zippers or zipper toggles or braids, or, you name it. It's been suggested extraneous little faces or bodies were climbing around here and there, all sorts of different theories that have been put out there. So I'm in short, I'm as certain as I can be, short of having stood there on the sandbar in 1967 and witnessed the event myself, that this is the real deal. There are so many just technical aspects of the film and the film subject, but even from a broader context, the one that I like to emphasize from a scientific framework is that what you see in 1967, which was absolutely counterintuitive, which was why the scientists said it can't exist, it can't be real, and then went to great lengths to come up with these inane arguments why it wasn't real. Like, one of my favorites was Dr. John Napier, who was one of the more open-minded of those scientists who viewed it. But he said, what I see when I look at this, from the waist up, it looks essentially like an ape. But from the waist down, it looks like a human. He said it's almost inconceivable to imagine that such a hybrid, such a mosaic of structure in nature. So one half must, or the other must be contrived, ergo the whole thing's fake. Well, isn't it interesting that he stated this in his book? He was motivated enough after the viewing of that to investigate the subject of the Yeti and Bigfoot, and wrote a book which was published in 1971, 71, 72, and then 73, 74, Lucy was discovered, Australopithecus afarensis, much more extensive skeletal remains with the pelvis and the knee and the ankle. And how did they describe it? From the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, she looks like a little human. Isn't it interesting how evolution has combined in unexpected ways these primitive and derived traits? Well, that was the linchpin for Napier. What if he rejected? What if he, for him rejecting that? What if he had waited a year or two before he finished his book, and these discussions were had about Australopithecines? Would his conclusions have been different? Anyway, you can go down a long laundry list of unusual, seemingly unusual, in the context of 1960s anthropology, combinations of trait, flat face but massive jaws, the lack of canines but no tools, a flat, flexible foot with a non-divergent big toe. And each of those was counterintuitive in 1967, and yet now that's exactly how we envision early hominids, to the T. I mean, I could take a picture from the Patterson-Gimlin film and use it as an illustration in an introductory anthropology text of what we think a robust Australopithecine looks like.
Exactly.
If you ignored the scale and you didn't have the stigma of what that image, that iconic image was. That's exactly what we think a Paranthropus poisii looked like in East Africa. So yet we didn't have fossils, at least we didn't have analyses of the very early discoveries of those fossils. And not nearly.
Kelly, let me turn to you. You probably know that in UFO law there's an incident called the Hopkinsville or the Kelly Hopkinsville incident, where supposedly these little creatures, green creatures, attacked this farmer's house. And I remember years ago reading in one of those books from the 70s of a similar thing. I just looked it up here. Something called the Battle of Ape Canyon, where apparently some loggers were attacked by multiple Sasquatches who even threw boulders at their cabin and whatnot.
Yeah, that was Washington State. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there was another one that I do remember. It's in 1924. Supposedly, a guy was captured by a Bigfoot family and was with them for a week or so, and then left unharmed. Why don't we? Do you think that we don't have that? Wouldn't it? I mean, if, for example, with everyone with cell phones, I mean, is this something that, I mean, it seems anomalous that if we're talking that a group of however many Bigfoot would suddenly, start throwing boulders at these loggers. What talk about that particular incident and its place in Bigfoot lore.
Well, it was near Mount St. Helens, and supposedly there was an altercation. It was a war. I have not found any real solid evidence to support that ever happened. And believe me, I have looked because I kept thinking I would be able to find someone, or at least someone's kid, who had actually had first-hand knowledge of this experience. So I have not found any evidence. Just like there are people that say that they've killed Bigfoot bodies and buried them, and they know just where they're buried, and I'll prove it to you because I know where I buried it, and it never ever turns up again. And then there's the guys in Georgia that say we found a Bigfoot, and it has roadkill all over it, and it's real, honest, and they freeze it into a freezer and sell it to a guy named Tom Biscardi for like 25 grand, and it's a gorilla costume. There are a lot of hoax. There are a lot of things that may or may not exist. And those are the things that most of the books are written about, especially for kids, because then you can bring it to the conclusion of see how fake this is. You don't have to worry. It's not real.
Yeah.
But there were no books that presented the possible evidence, the scientific evidence, the things that might support the idea that it was real. And that's what's more interesting to me, the things that, and it wasn't at first. I wrote a book called Tales of the Cryptids. And again, I thought most of those were probably not real. But Bigfoot was just stood out in a field of many, many mysterious animals. So I'm not sure that ever happened. I think it makes for a great story, and maybe someday if I write fiction, I'll write a novel about it. Yeah. But again, I don't see why apex predators would choose to do a life-threatening battle unless it was over the young or territory you're going to lose in an argument with men and any animal that made the observation about humans, loggers. Yeah. They're cutting down all your trees. You're not going to go and fight them for territory because you're going to lose. So I find it hard to believe that actually happened. Maybe it did, but I lean towards thinking I found no hard evidence that ever happened.
Michelle, since you're a folklorist too, I know when I was a kid in the 80s, early to mid 80s, I find a lot of these books by, about these kinds of subjects, Charles Berlitz for UFOs and the Von Daniken kind of books. And there was always the repetition of a lot of these things where the things slowly mutated. Two ones that stand out to me is there was a supposed person named David Gray who apparently disappeared and was one of those where his footprints were in the snow and then he just disappeared into another dimension, except there was never that person in the town mentioned, and it was just bruited through yellow journalism. And the second one that comes to mind is in Europe there was what were called the Green Children of Woolpit, about these green children who were found and came from another dimension where there was no sun supposedly, and it was supposed, I guess, in Wales. But in a lot of these books, they would be in Germany or in Spain or in France. And do you think that a lot of similar things like this incident I spoke with Kelly about are the Bigfoot Sasquatch equivalent of these green children kind of tales that are just repeated until they never, or maybe they were just hoaxes that caught on? What is your take on that?
There's definitely a lot of echoes. Like when a story hits, like even back at the turn of the century, there was the equivalent of the weird news that we have on the AP wire.
Well, like Bat Boy. Remember Bat Boy from
Yes, yeah, very tabloid. Yeah, but these are legit papers who are seizing on these little tidbits of stories from across the country and running them locally because they're completely off the rails. And, I've dealt with that in some of my research because there's an 1855 account in Maine of a man finding a tiny, black hair covered human-like creature. And most of the accounts came from newspapers across the country. And it wasn't until a few years ago where a local reporter actually found a local printing of the story that we became a little more confident that this might have actually happened locally and wasn't just created elsewhere and attributed to Maine. So there's a lot of stuff like that does happen. There are plenty of newspapers that like to keep their readers entertained or see if they can provoke them with stories that seem rather unbelievable. And they swap them around. There's a lot of stories I've worked on where I wonder, I'm like, the details of this story sound suspiciously like the story from 10 years before that. It's been slightly skewed, but it's really the same story. Now, is it just somebody going back to an old newspaper and saying, oh, we can use this old chestnut again, and transplanting it 10 years forward and pretending it's a new story and slightly changing the details? There's a couple of stories of, hairy wild men attacking and killing lumberjacks in Maine that I have tried to find the actual, documentable, alignable details about to try to figure out if they're legit or not. And they happen 10 years apart and they're in the same general location. And so I have big question marks attached to that because of that, because there's no way to verify any of it. And it really makes me think that maybe an editor got really creative and, just rolled out the chestnut to use it again. So there's plenty of that stuff that goes on. And, some of the folklore I've researched for Maine, I'll read, I read copious amounts of, folklore books, and I will find some authors will take stories from elsewhere and put them in Maine just because they need to fill in the pages of a book that has to be about Maine, and it drives me crazy. I'm just like,
it doesn't matter. Portland, Oregon, Portland, Maine, same place, So let's end this here, and let me just ask Jeff, what will it take to verify scientifically that these types of creatures exist? What do you think the odds are that it will in your lifetime, say? And with every passing year, doesn't it get more remote that it will be?
Well, I guess the bottom line is conclusive evidence will rest most likely on physical remains of some sort. If someone comes in with a jaw or a tooth or leg bone or something, or it may be just by happenstance a semi truck hits one on a rural highway, or a hunter does shoot one and has the presence of mind to follow up and report it and document it and so forth. Almost all encounters, you have to bear in mind, almost all encounters are by pure happenstance. The credible reports are the individuals may or may not have been on the lookout for evidence of Sasquatch, but the encounter is almost always purely by chance. Now, our approach has been and continues to be to try to get that elusive DNA evidence. There is really no precedent for recognizing a new species on the basis of DNA alone. We've used DNA to differentiate, say, subspecies or sibling species from museum specimens, but those specimens exist. But there is a growing discussion in the literature that, in the case of rare and elusive, endangered species, that perhaps it's time that we, abandon the Victorian ethic of shoot first and ask scientific questions second, to use a voucher specimen of a DNA sequence to establish the existence. Maybe Sasquatch will be the test case of that. And so I think the future is promising. There are improving technology in aerial reconnaissance and both thermal imaging, using thermal imaging as a detection device, but also LiDAR. There was an article recently where drones equipped with LiDAR were able to detect large mammals.
And LiDAR is what? What is LiDAR?
LiDAR is using a laser to penetrate and map these fantastic maps of the Mayan ruins on the Yucatan Peninsula with a blanket of forest over them. These are all exposed using LiDAR.
Okay.
And as the resolution improves, then your ability to discriminate smaller objects improves. Another line of evidence, I think, or line of inquiry rather, would be environmental DNA, where we can cast the net more broadly, and by sampling water or soil where there's a good chance that a Sasquatch may have been in the vicinity or proximity, like soil beneath the footprint. There was an interesting case where snow beneath the footprint in, I think it was Bhutan, was examined and identified. I think it was turned out to be bear. I can't remember the details, but the point was they were successful in getting traces of DNA from the snow beneath the footprint. So those have prospects. So I don't think, I'm not pessimistic in thinking that as time goes on, we're less likely, because it's not like we're standing still technologically. So with passing time, the technologies are improving. It's just whether we have those who are willing and capable of applying those in the field. Unfortunately, health issues. I'm 63 now as well, and some mounting health issues are making it more and more challenging for me to spend any lengthy time in the field. Mm-hmm. And so, I used to be out because of the flexibility of my academic schedule, my teaching schedule. I could devote up to a month at a time or more during the summer months in the field and sustain an effort. And that's what it's going to take. There are no people, no professionals, scientists who are doing that kind of field work, besides myself. And anyway, so yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm hoping in my lifetime. I unfortunately have seen colleagues make the same wish and optimistically predict that it would happen, only to see their demise.
So Kelly, let me ask you. Getting more back to the mythological aspect, if, let's say, do you think that if there isn't any proof by, say, 2050 or 2100, does that mean that the creature slips more off into myth? Because as he just said, Jeff, technologically, if we can't find it with all of these newfangled equipment and drones are gonna become much more, they're gonna be everywhere. Does that mean that Bigfoot just slips into the total myth category? And what is your own personal opinion on that?
Well, I think there's also a possibility that it will slip rather than myth into extinction, because we do have global warming and we do have terrible things happening to our planet right now because we have not been good stewards of our planet. It worries me that if it's a small population, that it may be suffering the same way other animals are. We're losing our frogs, we're losing our big cats, we're losing many, many animals. But we are also discovering new animals. In 1999 in Peru, they found a little teeny mammal in a tree. Found one, got one picture, didn't catch it, but it was confirmed as a real scientific animal. It really confuses me why they can see one animal one time and not take it home. And that's real. But Bigfoot isn't. There's no chance that there's, a bipedal great ape. Yeah, it's possible that it'll be proven that it's not real because we don't find it. But I think it's more likely that it's a diminishing number. And if we lose it to extinction.
Michelle, what is your take on what she just said, and do you believe that it'll be found in your lifetime?
It would be awesome if it was. That would be really great. I have some eyewitnesses that have been waiting decades, thinking that somewhere along the way somebody would have done that by now, and we haven't. But I think part of whether it would, slide more fully into myth would rely on the public perception of it. And I think right now we're at a point where probably a greater percentage, at least in the U.S., there's probably a greater percentage of people who are convinced that Bigfoot exists, even not having had their own experiences, than probably ever in our history, thanks to the prevalence of, shows like Finding Bigfoot and Expedition Bigfoot and all of that stuff. So, if that continues, I think the mythology end of it will still remain, because the legends and the people who think it's real can coexist. I was having a discussion with somebody else about that recently. I think that what Kelly was saying about threats to the population do exist. I was talking to Peter Byrne a few months ago, and he's up in the Pacific Northwest, and he's very concerned because there's been a huge amount of logging, and between that and the fires, the activity reports that they're getting have nosedived, and so he's worried that there's almost nothing left where he is. So I think in those situations you'll see more migration to areas that aren't as threatened, which will probably mean them going even further away from human populations, which means less likelihood that we'll, come in contact with them. But, that's all guesswork based on the movement of what's happening now. But
Can I do one more thing before you
Yeah.
pass it over to Jeff? I almost hope we don't find one, simply because the inclination of humanity will be to cage it, and I don't think it's a place. Cage is not a place for this animal.
Yeah.
Well, my thing is, even if they found it, it'll be on the top of the news, Google News, for an hour or so, and then Kim Kardashian will stick something up her butt, and it'll be gone. So I mean, anyway, I will link to Kelly's Wonders of Weird website, Jeff's academic website, and Michelle, I guess I'll link to your Amazon page.
No, you can link to greenhandbookshop.com. Because I have signed copies of my book on my shop's website.
You said Green Hand?
They could,
Green Hand?
greenhandbookshop.com.
Okay.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. And I want to thank you for spending about an hour and 40 minutes speaking about it. So thank you very much.